Boulez. We spent a lot of time preparing our book, which is translated in English, I think, the best way, Path to Boulez. That's the title which it gets because our conversations had the character of trajectories. Trajectories established because to bring closer your work to the music lover. Of course, we will not speak, it has been said about Moses and Aron from the side of the staging of Peter Steins, because on the 3rd of October he will give a lecture about it. But in more general terms, we can perhaps speak about Schönberg and also about this masterpiece. I remember that many times you pointed out that speaking about Neoclassicism, you are not at very good terms, to put it mildly, the Neoclassicistic works of Stravinsky. But as I read in one of the interviews you gave recently, you call Moses and Arnold Schönberg a neoclassical work. What I want to ask you is this. On one side you have the neoclassicism of Stravinsky and that of Schönberg, and you are a great admirer, of course, of Moses and Arnold. Can you explain that?
Yes, I think I can explain it, so more or less. Certainly, the point of view of Stravinsky and Schoenberg on classicism are not at all the same. I remember that I wrote a piece a long time ago, after the death of Stravinsky in 1971. I was asked to write a piece about Stravinsky, and finally I did not write only about Stravinsky, but I was writing about the parallel that Adorno has made between Schoenberg and Stravinsky. And he called Stravinsky the reactionary, or more or less, and Schoenberg the progressive. And I thought it was quite wrong to have this kind of view, because of course Adorno was very devoted to the Vienna School and to Schoenberg especially. And they despised or discarded Stravinsky very lightly. And I think that's on the contrary, if something can bring quite close to each other, Stravinsky and Schoenberg, that's the ideal of neoclassicism. As a matter of fact, they were not the only ones, because you could see that in literature, you could see that in painting also. It seems to me that this generation of Stravinsky and Schoenberg, and other people also around, which was born, Schoenberg is born in 1874 and Stravinsky in 1882, so that's just 8 years difference, that's much difference. And as a matter of fact, Ravel is in between, 75, born in 1875. And in fact also, in all these composers, Ravel included, the desire of the law, the Gesetz in German. So, in Moses and Aron, there is a lot of talk about Gesetz. And that's not really quite by chance, because the moment in the life of Schoenberg of exploration, which was just before the First World War, from 1909 until 1914, practically, was really a moment of wild exploration. And when you see the works which are out of that, not only the Opus 16, but also the theatrical works like Erwartung, Die glückliche Hand, the leader of Opus 22, the beginning of Jakob Streiter. Really, that's something where all laws are abolished and transgressed. And you have the same kind of attitude, like for instance Kandinsky. When Kandinsky began his abstract painting, it was approximately in the same time. And you see a desire for experimentation and for getting rid of everything which tradition has proposed. And then after making this, having made these big gestures of transgression, then you have the impression that everybody is afraid of something. And is afraid that, you cannot live in transgression forever, because you will lose track of the musical language, and you cannot just go on only transgressing, because at the end of the transgression you have the what the Russian painters found. You find the white square or the black square with nothing in it, just nothing anymore. And certainly these people were afraid of nothing, nihilism. And therefore, I mean, they began to find the laws again. And certainly with Kandinsky, it was exactly the same attitude. Even with Klee, who was much more inventive in a way, progressive, in a kind of very more restricted field. But you see also this desire in the paintings of this period, Mondrian above everybody, this desire for geometry. And visually, that's very striking, the desire of geometry of these three people at the same time, Kandinsky, Klee, and Mondrian. And I suppose that you can transpose that in music, and you have also the same desire for a very strict geometry, which contains this kind of transgression you have made. And you discover progressively the law, the gazettes again. And certainly Schönberg was very serious about the gazettes, the law, because he was belonging to a tradition. And he could not get out of this tradition. The tradition was Bach, was Mozart, was Beethoven, was Brahms, was Wagner. And more Brahms and Bach than even Beethoven or Wagner. And there is something very strong in the discipline of Schoenberg. And certainly he was serious about it. He wanted to find a language which was in the same time classical, but using other words, which I call once, sometimes my humor is not always very well understood, but I thought it was a kokoschisiert Brahms, you know, and that's a little bit, you know, the portrait of Brahms through Kokoschka, you know, and he has this kind of vision with a solid elements of grammar, but with what seems at first a distorted vocabulary. So it is, you know, it is an attitude which can be strange to us. And I had not great understanding for that, I remember, when I was younger. Maybe because I was younger, precisely. And now, with age, I see that with bigger distance. And I think certainly the effort of Schoenberg is certainly very valid. I will tell you more about the language of Moses, but I mean, we began with comparison between Stravinsky and Schoenberg. Stravinsky does not belong to a tradition like Schoenberg, not at all. He's an outsider. He's, you know, tied with a kind of Russian tradition, as short as it is, because in the time of Stravinsky there was a very, you know, not even a century of tradition. There was, and the tradition was a kind of nationalistic tradition, like Rimsky-Korsakov, especially at the end of his life. And Mussorgsky was the big exception, and you have Tchaikovsky, Rimsky, also two things which are not, you know, not together, which don't go well together. You had a discrepancy already in that, and Mussorgsky was a complete outsider. And Stravinsky was belonging to a country with no tradition, or the only tradition, if you can call that, even that was the French tradition, and in France we have no tradition either from this point of view. There is, you know, there are exceptions, but there are no tradition like in Germany, for instance, or in Germanic music. And so Stravinsky, when after this period of research and experiments and, you know, adventure, then I mean, also he saw that he could not go further, very much further, without having in his grip a vocabulary much more logic, much more consequent. But the attitude of Stravinsky was like you go into an antique shop. And then, I mean, you look at the works of the past, and for instance, you see an old trumpet, which is 100 years old. Oh, you see, that's very interesting. I will make a lamp out of it. And, you know, you transform, like the antiquarians, you transform a trumpet into a lamp. And that's funny. And that's a kind of distorted view of things. He did not look for a vocabulary in that, but I mean, he distorted and made another image of that. you know, I think that Schönberg was kokoschkisierend Brahms. And I can say here, you know, the relationship of Stravinsky with history is much more like somebody, like a designer, like a decorator, which take an object and change the function of the object without changing too much the object. You put maybe a lamp in it, and that will be a bulb, I mean, in it, and it becomes a lamp. But I mean, that's a game. He plays with the history. Schoenberg doesn't play at all. He's deadly serious, as I mean, you know, for this sake. And therefore, for me, as I mean, the game of Stravinsky sometimes is, you know, a game I personally don't appreciate very much. But I understand that all other people can find the kind of distortion of, you know, of displacement of the object interesting. But for instance, I was speaking with one of you the other day, and for me, as I mean, I compare, for instance, the fugues of Stravinsky in the Symphony of Psalms, the second movement, and the fugue which opens the music for strings and percussion celesta of Bartók. And the fugue of Stravinsky is a fugue with, of course, different intervals, but you have the first subject of fugue, and then at the fifth you have the answer, and then you have the other answer. You know, that's with different intervals, but that's typically the fugue as you see in the Baroque time. Only imitated, just painted with another color.
Like the Rijekare of Bach Musikalische Opfer. It has something to do with that kind of theme.
Well, that's less complicated. That's the Musikalische Opfer. That's you know, the technique of Stravinsky in the fugue is much more simple, to not say rudimentary. And you have these Handelian rhythms, which are a quote of history. You know, you have the dotted rhythms like that. Okay, but I mean, in Bartók, then as I mean, you have a completely different conception of the fugue. It begins first with different phrases which breathe differently, and then this breathing, which is a kind of expansion of horizontal phrasing, then the fugue begins to expand in another direction, because you have the first sentence above, under, and getting from A, you get to the E flat, the maximum, you know, the maximum of occupation of the space, of the musical space. And then we begin and it finishes by A. So you have a complete new conception of the fugue, and you cannot think at all, when you hear this movement, you don't think at all of Bach, of Handel, of anything. You have a pure Bartók. When you are listening to the fugue of the Symphony of Psalms, you hear somewhere, you know, a classical fugue, only a little bit tilted. And that makes the difference for me between, you know, you can be inspired by something, but you have to go to the core of the question. You have to go to the very bottom of the problem to solve that in a different way, which is not just a kind of imitation with some different features. And that's the difference also between Schoenberg and Stravinsky. Of course, sometimes in Schoenberg, I mean in Moses, you know, when you are repeating, especially, you know, as we are now, you can be sometimes irritated by the fact that if you have a canonic writing, very literal, you hear dot 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 dot, well the other voice dot 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 dot, and so on. And then you say, oh well, I mean, he could stretch that or compress that. You know, the imitation, the kind of literal imitation is sometimes you say it's too much of a good thing, and that's true. That's the style of Moses, especially in the choir, is really compared to the best Baroque music, and some choral parts of Moses are to be compared with some choral parts of the cantatas or the passions by Bach. I mean, literally, that's the model, really the model of the writing. Only I say with different notes. But for instance, rhythmically, and that's very strange to see that in Schoenberg when you compare, for instance, the first words like Erwartung or like Die glückliche Hand, to speak only of the theatrical words, with Moses, you find a kind of invention which has been so disciplined that it had lost quite a lot of flourish and of invention even. Because you can think that's, you know, Schoenberg wanted that, but I think that's a kind of interaction. Because a certain stylistic approach, canonic approach, you know, imitation and so on, implies a certain type of ideas which bring back the Baroque style, and in a way. And on the contrary, the perpetual invention, renewal of the ways of looking at the musical language brings, on the contrary, a lot of differentiation in the vocabulary, the rhythm which are more flexible, a kind of invention of melodic features which is much more constantly renewed, and so on and so forth. That's, I call, the neoclassical approach of Schoenberg, and you can see the model, and you can see that the model forced Schoenberg sometimes to invent a different type of melodic lines, of a way of constructing the material. And also there is the question, in fine, there is the question of the tonal, and that's a very strictly written work in 12 tone. You know, when studying the score again, I have not studied really the score for 21 years, so I came quite fresh there. And just for my sake, just to remember how it was constructed, I looked at the 12 tone construction, just for my interest, you know, to not only, I don't count from 1 to 12, that's very easy to do, but I mean, just to see how we use the harmonic features of the tonal. And that's really quite remarkable, because he is extremely economical. And once you have discovered the trick, you can make it very easily, you know, to look at the score. Because when you have, for instance, at some point, you have chords of 3, you know, 3 notes. And you have A, B, C, and let's say D, E, F here. You can be sure that you have F, G, I, H, G, K here. And if you have D, E, F here, you will have A, B, C here. Or if you have A, B, C here, you will have D, E, F here. That's extremely virtuoso in a way. I mean, that's done with great virtuosity, but you see the limitation he imposed on himself. And I'm sure that part of this neoclassicism comes also for the strict aspects of the technique he used, which was not allowing him, or just he was repeating the notes. If you have, you know, you cannot just do ABC, and sometimes you have ABC, ABC, ABC with different rhythm, because it makes a full bar. And then as on the next bar, you have D, E, F, D, E, F, D, E, F, and so on. And so, you know, he stretched the use of the notes, but certainly is more or less sometimes in a kind of straitjacket. But he's, like Houdini, is very able to get out of this straitjacket, although the straitjacket is still there. So that was very interesting for me to analyze that, to see the kind of virtuosity with which he used a kind of very simple technique, finally, which is very obvious. Maybe that's less obvious when one hears, because the notes are changed in position, are changed in rhythm, are changed in register, but very often, you know, he was avoiding the octave all the time. And there, on the contrary, when he used, for instance, the 3 notes ABC or ABCD, he used the ABCD with just not transposing, but literally putting them in another register. And therefore, that's not that easy to listen to always, but most of the time that's quite easy, and sometimes very easy even. For instance, the last chorus of the first act, you know, you have a pure imitation between soprano and altos on one side, tenors and basses on another side, and the imitation is in octave. You know, you have the same patterns, exactly the same patterns, with two bars distance. So he comes back to a certain type of classicism because of this, what the 12-tone technique imposed to him to do. I think I have done enough on neoclassicism.
very clear, but
at least I have the 13-tone row.
it's like a little college you gave us, and so very clearly. So, but perhaps it's an interesting question when we speak about the great technical kinship of Schönberg in relation with 12 note. If you compare it with Berg, what do you say? How is because he, in his own way, uses also the 12 note tradition.
Berg was clever in another direction. You know, as you maybe know, I conducted Lulu, and also when looking at the score very closely and very, you know, going into detail of some, not of all the piece, but I mean of some very characteristic moments of the piece, then I would say that Berg is trusting the father, but trying to get the father under the table very well. Because he has a kind of system which is absolutely marvelous. You know, he has the main row, tone row of 12 tone. I'm speaking of Lulu now. I will speak of the concerto later, the violin concerto especially. He has, you know, a tone row, and he begins extraordinary combination. For instance, he takes a sound out of 5, and that it makes, of course, so after a certain number, that makes again a 12 row, a tone row. And then he makes a theme out of it, and he says that's the theme of Alba. And then he makes, for instance, a row out of 7. I don't remember exactly now after so many years, but I mean, a tone row out of each 7 notes will be, you know, kept at the first note. And so it gives another tone row. And then somebody say that will be the row of Dr. Schön, and so on and so forth. So, you know, he respects the father, as I mean the order of Schoenberg. He does not want to be scolded by Schoenberg. I say, yes, I've done my good work with the 12 tone, and then I skip it. And then I make a theme out of it. And then he works with the theme, which goes back, as I mean, into a very normal technique. Yeah? And that's very, very strange, the kind of approach of Berg. Because also, when he did in the violin concerto, he found a row, tone row, where he could have G minor and B flat major. So he was out of it, you know, very easily, and just by which is very funny that he has at the beginning a very strict combination, and at the end he just escapes this combination. You find that also in the Lyric Suite, for instance, in the Allegro Misterioso. What he wants to have, as we know now, he wants 4 letters of the alphabet, you know, A, B, and H, and F. He wants that as an ostinato, because he wants these 2 names tied with a symbolic figure. And he finds a way, you know, to combine some kind of tone rows with specific intervals. And then finally, he arrives to what he wants, A, B flat, and some in an H and an F, and some in a B natural and F. And that is by Berg, that's a real process of escaping. That's a wonderful escapist with great grace, as a matter of fact. But at the beginning, you find, you know, a strict obedience. And that's the contrast between the strict obedience and the escapism, which makes all the value of Berg in my, to my eyes, at least.
It's interesting what you're telling me, because if I'm not mistaken, there were really great tensions between Schönberg and Berg, I think, at some time. If I remember the time when he wrote the orchestral pieces of the 6th, by the way, 27th of October, he dedicated to Schönberg, but it's very difficult to find anything about what Schönberg thought about that piece. Do you know anything of that?
Well, I don't know, I'm not a specialist, but I mean, I have read, because I was supposed to write a preface, and I wrote the preface, and the preface was never published because the book was never published. The correspondence between Berg and Schönberg, it was published in English. You know, it is published in English, therefore I read it, and it was supposed to be published in French, but there was a question of copyright and so on. Short, I mean, the book was not being permitted to be published. But I read all these letters, and I remember, I mean, I was on a tour with my ensemble to New Zealand and Australia. You can imagine the time I had on the plane to read that. So I read that very carefully, and that's the relationship of Schoenberg with Berg is one of the most strangest you can see. That's a kind of father-son relationship, you know. And at first, that's what I mean, you know, Schoenberg says, well, do that for me, and you must do that for me, and so on. And why don't you compose? You know, Schoenberg say, but you asked me to do that and to do that. And to, you know, he takes, not like a slave, but I mean, like a help, which is very often solicited. And then comes Wozzeck. No, it comes a point which is very touching, I must say, when Berg writes to Schoenberg and says, you know, if you don't like me, we have to part company. That's a rather long letter which reminded me very strongly of the letter, the famous letter to Kafka to his father. You know, when he said, you know, we cannot understand each other, that's finished, and so on. A very long letter of Kafka, which is more beautiful, of course, than the one by Berg, literally speaking. But I mean, they are both approximately at the same peak of desolation. And then, after that, Schoenberg said, no, sorry, it goes. Then Wozzeck. And first, also, Schoenberg was not at all confident that a man as soft, apparently, as Berg, could do Wozzeck with all these trivial things, with his vulgarities, with the shock and so on. And came Wozzeck as a performance in Berlin. And then, as I mean, Schoenberg was really surprised and speechless, more or less. So he pays, you know, his tribute to Berg, saying, yes, I appreciate, but you see still, you know, the man was struck by that. Therefore, the two works of von Huytermorgen and Moses and von Huytermorgen, especially Moses, are a direct consequence of the success of Wozzeck in Berlin 1925, because it came immediately after. And then there is another touching moment at the end when Schoenberg is in America, in Los Angeles, or on the East Coast, first Boston, and then after in Los Angeles. And then, you know, he's isolated, and he thinks with nostalgia to this time. And then, as I mean, the kind of father-son relationship comes very warmly then when Schoenberg regrets this time. So you have this big curve along this line, along this life, which is very touching, and that was certainly not a simple relationship, because I suppose for Schoenberg, Berg represented all what he did not want to fall in. You know, he wanted discipline. He did not want sentimentality. He did stick to his gun, let's say, where Berg was, on the contrary, trying, you know, to make the gun more agreeable and more pleasant. So you had all this difference of character, and I think, for instance, Schoenberg was much easier with Weber, because Weber was more strict, less successful than he was. So the relationship was easier, but with Berg certainly the relationship was difficult. But I repeat, I think that's the theatrical project of Schoenberg in the 30s were a direct consequence of the Wozzeck performance in Berlin and performance all over Germany.
Thank you very much, Mr. Boulez.
Therefore, the critics have had an amazingly difficult time with the work. What is your point on that? Your point of view?
The Erwartung is a work which you don't see the difference between the dream or the nightmare and reality.
Yes.
That's exactly the point. And on the theatre, I suppose you have PIERRE has also a couple of ideas on it. But that makes the thing, because you don't know, for instance, if the lover, the man, is really dead, if that's an imagination of the woman, you don't know that. And I suppose that this kind of dreamlike or nightmare-like quality, which makes that's a kind of psychological drama inside the woman, certainly. And whatever it is a nightmare or it is a reality, it reflects, this reality reflects anyway in the psyche of the woman, and then something we have to go through. And that's what one says, that's an oscillum on the psyche of the woman, certainly.
But in other words, if I may ask again, so actually the libretto is the cause of the subconscious treatment of the work?
Well, the libretto, you know, I suppose that Schoenberg needed that for this moment. First, so I will tell you, for me that's very tied to two things. First, to the vocabulary of Schoenberg, which was not fixed, as I told before.
Yeah, yeah.
So that was a kind of vocabulary still, like a lava, I mean, you know, like a volcano, still in vomiting fire, you know. And then, I mean, he needed something which could fit with this language. And I think, I mean, that was the first thing. And second, he refused all kind of classical form. And therefore, that's also the reason for such a libretto. And I think, I mean, he did not take a libretto outside like that. So when somebody was writing a play, and then he took that. No, he was discussing with Marie Pappenheim, and wanted this type of libretto. And then it was a kind of collaboration between them.
Yes, trouble with the critics, of course, who couldn't grasp it.
Well, that's not the first time, really not the last time, I suppose. Psychological elements.
I think very much.
Aron, are there other people who want to ask a question to Mr. Boulez? Come to the fore, Mr. Snickers.
Well, it has something to do with what you just told us about this relationship between Schoenberg and Berg. Do you think there might be some relationship with the two persons of the Moses and Aron? Moses in his strict way of gazettes, Aron, the one who wants to be like the son to the father, or the younger brother to the elder brother, trying to escape the strong gazettes of the father. Do you think there might be any influence in his, I'm not speaking of the religious side, but just superimposing his relationship with Berg on the subject and the choosing of the strict Moses, also the way of speaking, and also using all the time the word gazettes, and the more freestyle of Aron?
Well, I say that was the Berg-Schoenberg relationship was a father-son. Aron and Moses are brothers, which is already quite different, I suppose, strictly speaking, as I mean. But I don't think that has to be related really to another person. That has to be related to the environment, simply that. Because when he wrote Moses, some works of his were successful, but the old works, for instance, Verklärte Nacht, even also, I mean, just before he began the composition of Moses, there was a concert in Vienna of Gurre-Lieder, which were very successful. But the reaction at this time said, oh, that was the old Schoenberg, he could have done better and not be so austere, not so be obstinate, and so on and so forth. So that was a dialogue with himself, I suppose, much more than with anybody else. And also the fact that he was very aggressive toward any environment. I suppose you have read the preface of the Drei Satiren, opus 28, when he attacks everybody, practically. I mean, only himself is out of attack. Certainly he attacks the neoclassicists, he attacks the people who use folklore, he attacks that and that and that and that, and finally you say, ah, he's the only one. You know, certainly he was very theocratic, you know. He thought always in terms of God, and himself being a God, you know, because when you read the statements he did, or the letters he wrote, or any kind of article he wrote, it was always to defend himself against other things. He say, I am the right one. And that's exactly the position of Moses. He said, I am the right one, but in the same time, he sees that the other ones are more successful than he is, directly, you know. And I think that's the world and him, and that's not only a kind of strict relationship, because I think, you know, either Berg or Weber were very devoted to him, extremely, excessively devoted even, and so therefore he did not feel that as a kind of, he did not fear a kind of relationship. But certainly he was always offended to have a very difficult relationship. I was reading again, I was offered this wonderful book on Schoenberg, you know, with all the excerpts, and I was reading something. I knew the book already, but I reread something. And when you see how bitter he is at the end, because of course he had a very difficult life in Los Angeles, how bitter he is that, for instance, Boston never played a work of him, that in Los Angeles the work practically never performed, and so on and so forth. So he said, I have so much value in myself, and I am so little recognized. It was certainly a permanent tragedy of his life. And in the same time, he had always the protection of, not a court, that would be exaggerated to say that, but of pupils. You know, I know rarely of anybody who had people so devoted to him completely, as I mean. So he had this side, like Wagner, as a matter of fact. You know, the people around him, you know, he was solidly, you know, on them, like that. And at the same time, he did not understand that everybody was not like that. I think that's the dilemma of his character. And certainly the Moses plot, so let's say, apart from the religious side, which is different, which is a preoccupation of his, which came not late in life, but in the middle of his life, the religious preoccupation is something else. But I mean, the character of Moses and Aron, and this dialogue, is deeply a dialogue inside himself.
I saw one question there by this gentleman, please.
You told us about a very personal and new fugue technique of Bartok, but does it also mean that you really consider it a weakness of Schoenberg not to have developed something like that in Moses and Aron, to have made use of literal, almost Baroque-like techniques and imitations?
No, I don't consider, you know, that's the difference between me being young and me being older. I don't judge or condemn or anything. I say simply Schoenberg has done that. I prefer other ways. That's all what I can say. But I say that in his situation, I don't think he could do otherwise. Or he would have been Weber, which is not Schoenberg, so, you know, because Weber used practically the same technique as Schoenberg, even more simplified. You know, for instance, if you see the Opus 24, which is the, you know, epitome of the kind of technique like that, you have also the side A, B, C, D, E, F, and so on, you know, 3 notes, 3 notes, 3 notes. But in Weber, first, you don't have this stylistic influence. You know, in spite of the technique, you don't have any stylistic influence, or if you have the same Baroque technique, or pre-Baroque technique, even pre-classical technique, he used, for instance, the cutting of the phrase, also the interferences between the registers of voices, so you are lost, you know. You don't perceive the voices so precisely like in Schoenberg, for instance. In Schoenberg, the voices are there, and then you perceive them as a continuity. In Weber, because of the rests in between, and between also of the interferences between the voice crossing each other. You know very well that in the classical technique, in the Baroque technique, you cross the voice as little as possible. You know, that's a law practically, because you have to recognize the voices for what they are, as themselves. And then Schoenberg does the same, practically, so with very few exceptions. And on the contrary, Weber does transgress this law on purpose always. That you cannot understand really the voice as such, but you perceive them as a combination. You know? And the combination gives something, sometimes a result which is completely in contradiction with the technique he uses. And that makes it Weber. You know? But Schoenberg was Schoenberg, as I say.
And were there perhaps also practical reasons to return to a more, let's say, a normal kind of technique of writing? Because he probably wanted to see it performed, and wise would be more adaptable to that kind of style.
No, because we have the counter-example of that, which is von Morgan. You know, he wanted to write an operetta, practically. And with all this technique, that's difficult to believe that's an operetta. So this kind of style and stylistic approach is much more believable in Moses than in von Morgan. And therefore you see that it was not an intention of his to be lighter in Moses, for instance, because when he wanted to be lighter, that was in the Phonography of Morgan, really. You know, he thought it would be really an operetta with a big, like Francea, practically. And of course, I mean, the vocabulary and the language is not down to this point, if I may say so. Yes.
You used the term transgressions a few times. Can you explain what you mean with it? Because I know it's very important for
transgression, I mean, by just having laws, being, you know, the rule, practically, and then you don't want to obey to these rules, and you are going beyond these rules. That's as simple as a trans, you know, beyond this point.
Well, I think for the time being, oh yes, one important question, the last question. Yes, please.
We know that the composers from the second Viennese school were great admirers of music of Mahler.
Of music of what?
Of music of Mahler.
Mahler, yes.
Yes.
Do you think it's reasonable to regard Mahler as a kind of precursor of expressionism?
Mahler is a Janus face. You know, he's turned to the past and he's turned to the future. And you can take both faces at face value, if I can say so. Because, for instance, you know, you have, and generally that's the case with quite a lot of composers. But Mahler had a kind of you know, the language of Mahler sometimes, like Adorno said, as a matter of fact, I am not the first to say that, that's the language of Mahler from time to time is much less, quote-unquote, advanced than the one of Wagner, for instance. You know, when he goes to the kind of folklore, the language is very simplified. But on the other hand, you have all this kind of form in the Mahler symphonies, which is, on the contrary, quite difficult to perceive because that's first on the long range, and second, the construction, and especially from the Fifth Symphony on, the polyphony is very dense, very complex, and difficult to perceive as such. And that's the kind of modern side of Mahler. And therefore, I mean, you have somebody in the past like Bruno Walter, who was on the conservative side, and you have somebody like Schoenberg, who was on the progressive side. And I think that with Wagner, it was exactly the same. And still now, you can see this type of audience in Bayreuth who wants their Wagner to be absolutely not touched, never, you know, and to be conserved like that in eine Büchse. And then, as I mean, you have people who think that Wagner, on the contrary, is the beginning of something, and you have to you know, to take a new approach in time. Each time you are confronted with this music, which asks you questions very strongly. Therefore, I think, as I mean, some great composers are always ambiguous, and I find their ambiguity is interesting, precisely.
One very important question, otherwise I think time proceeds. I asked Mr. Peter de Kade to announce the next act of our meeting. One more question? Yes, please.
What is your own ambiguity?
Oh, that's to other people to describe it, so not me. Let at least try to keep the mystery than me.
We have asked, and I'm extremely pleased and of course very proud that Pierre is willing to present you the Edison 1995 for your late recording. And just to be sure that everybody knows which one it is, this one is there.
I will read it maybe very slowly, I don't know. But I hope to understand more than I have understood your speech, because there is time for that. And maybe I know the subject, so maybe I will be induced to understand much quicker than I would do otherwise. Thank you, and I see that you have made not only you know, a big effort, but to write a book in an original way, not only to read a chapter, but to to have some illusion even of the number of chapters, and that's, I am very touched by that, I must say, and I appreciate greatly. And I enjoyed myself also the meetings we had. Otherwise, I would not have been so patient. Certainly. Thank you so much for that, and thank you so much for taking the time and the money also to publish this book. So I am very touched by that. And second, so I would like to thank you also for this statue and all the sentences you wrote, which were very pleasant to listen to, of course. You know, I think that's one of my functions, and one of the functions of the ensemble. Inspired cannot say anything against it also. That's for playing contemporary music. I remember always this sentence by Berg, as a matter of fact, playing the classic as if they were new, which is quite rare, and playing new music as if it was classical. And I think as a mean we try to do that. We try not to have the new music played, you know, with great difficulty, but on the contrary, with natural, with passion, but it should seem natural. And I am happy that you recognize this quality in the Legati book, because I like these works. We tried our best to do them justice, and I'm happy that you recognize this effort. Thank you so much.
Graag even uit voor een drankje beneden, waar ook boeken voor jou aanwezig zijn en intakeformulieren voor de CD. Dank u wel voor uw aanwezigheid.